So I grew up in Davenport, Iowa. It's eastern Iowa. It's right on the nose, right on the Mississippi. Grew up just a few miles from the river. And I never had much connection with the wonder of creation. Now, there's something to be said about the rolling hills of the Midwest and the mighty Mississippi and all the things that come with growing up in the Midwest. But I'd never seen a mountain until I was 17 years old. I'd never been to an ocean. I'd been to the Great Lakes, which felt like an ocean. But I really didn't know until I was a junior in high school, and my dad and I drove across the country west, where we moved to Vancouver, Washington. And it was there that I was first introduced to the mountains and the rivers. I remember the first time I stood with my feet in the Pacific Ocean and was overwhelmed at how big it was. It was remarkable. With time, I started hiking more. I became an avid backpacker. I became an avid fly fisher. The mountains, the rivers, the trees was where I longed to be most days. I fell in love with it pretty quickly and found my way there. I was just simply hooked. And over time, I found that being in nature became a spiritual practice for me. And it wasn't intentional. I didn't go into my time wandering in the woods or fly fishing on rivers as a spiritual discipline. I just noticed that that's what it was for me. I noticed that after a time in nature, I was more centered. I felt more buoyed and grounded. I noticed that after time in nature, I had wrestled with stuff spiritually, that I could go out and I could ask questions of myself. I can ask questions of God. I could be formed spiritually in space out in the middle of nowhere in different ways than I could in my office or in a library or at home. It is in nature where I discovered thin spaces. Thin spaces is a Celtic tradition where it's this notion of space that is so full of God's goodness, where the distance between God and earth is thin. It's hard to tell the difference. I have a lot of thin spaces in my life. And it just became a spiritual discipline where my soul needed to get out into the woods from time to time. And there's a long-standing tradition, right? This isn't new. It's a long-standing tradition in the Christian tradition and also the Hebrew Jewish tradition. In Scripture itself, we find this connection between creation and worship. So one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 65. Psalmist says, "You visit the earth and water it. You greatly enrich it. The river of God is full of water. You provide the people with grain, for so you have prepared it. You water its furrows abundantly, settling its ridges, softening it with showers and blessing it with growth. You crown the year with your bounty. Your wagon tracks overflow with richness. The pastures of the wilderness overflow. The hills gird themselves with joy. The meadows clothe themselves with flocks. The valleys deck themselves with grain. They shout and sing together for joy." This is a worship song, but the psalmist is proclaiming, using creation as the driving metaphor and the place where that worship takes place. One of the well-known psalms, Psalm 95, has the refrain, "For the Lord is a great God, a great King above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth, and the heights of the mountains are also his. The sea is his, for he made it, and the dry land which his hands have formed." Creation and God have always been connected. Even in the very beginning, God steps back at the end of every day. And what does God proclaim about creation on that day? This is good. In my hunches, we also know this anecdotally. You've had experiences where you have stood in creation and have been moved. There's something transcendent. There's something bigger than yourself, something that pulls you that you really can't put your finger on, but you know there is something out there. So I grew up from high school through my college years, adult, and I then moved to Texas, 2016, 5 years ago. I don't know if you are aware of the geographical makeup of Dallas, but it's short on mountains. There are some hills, but mountains it's lacking. The rivers are brown. It's hot, right? Normal, traditional sort of going out in the summer. It's on the hell setting, which I was not used to coming from the Pacific Northwest. And I found myself slowly, what felt like shrinking. What had been a staple for my own sense of self, for my own grounding, would have been a staple for my own spiritual formation, was no longer accessible to me. And I had convinced myself that where I had experienced so much growth and connection with God, so much of my own spiritual formation in the Cascade Mountains and on the Olympic Peninsula and in these other places that are remarkable, that was the only place that I could experience it. My imagination for connecting once more to God's good creation was stifled. And there was this recurring theme, this cycle that was happening every year. I would go back to the Pacific Northwest. I would go on a backpacking trip. I would find myself full again, reconnect with God and reconnect with myself. And then I would come back to Dallas and I would feel those benefits slowly slipping away until I could finally take it no more and I had to get back to the mountains. It was almost as if I was taking a 5-gallon bucket up out into nature with me and filling it up with water, and I was bringing it back. And then I slowly was using that water to fulfill myself. But the problem is, that's a limited resource. It runs out. And every year I'd feel it run out. I was just needing to get back. And then last November, in the midst of COVID, in the midst of all the craziness, we got a puppy. She's a husky mix. She's smart. She's lovable. She's full of energy. And I would take her on daily walks, sometimes both evening and morning. And I noticed that I began to feel myself a little bit more centered. I noticed I was less anxious. The angst that I felt, that I had always attributed to not being in creation, was not as acute, as I discovered that what I always wanted and thought was only accessible in the Pacific Northwest or other amazing places of God's creation was actually just a few steps outside my front door. Now, obviously, walking around East Dallas is just a little bit different than walking in the Cascade Mountains. But God's good creation is everywhere. And like most things, the question is not, God, are you there? Or is God present? The question is, are we paying close enough attention to notice where God already is at, where God is already working in our midst? So 4 reasons that I think connecting with nature matters for our well-being. And these are probably not new. These aren't shocking, but sometimes we need to be reminded of this stuff. I know I do. Being in nature, being in creation, whether it's the mountains or whether it's a park near your house, it forces you to be present with the thing that's right in front of you. And we are so easily distracted by the stuff that's bothering us, that's already happened, or the stuff that's on our to-do list, but that there's something about being out in nature, being near a tree, or being in a garden, or being out in the mountains that helps us and forces us to pay attention, to be present with the thing right in front of us. That's the good thing about creation that pulls us back to ourselves. Being in creation also puts ourselves in the rightful place. We are not the creator. I remember the first time I stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon, and it's one of those things that you can't really oversell. It's actually grand. It's remarkable. And I just felt so small and insignificant and overwhelmed by the scene. But what's remarkable is I can also feel that way looking at a little pecan nut or a small little sapling or a tomato plant that's just starting to grow. Because there is this small thing, and that by some miracle, it grows into this remarkable thing that is taller than my house or produces remarkable vegetables to eat. Even there, looking at the smallest parts of creation, I find myself being pulled back into my rightful place. It helps me see that I'm not the one who makes the world go around, no matter how much I want to tell myself I do. I think also a third thing I want to point out, and this took me, I'm just now really coming to notice this, is it connects us back to our bodies. We live fragmented lives where we separate what we think, how we feel emotionally, and how we feel physically, what we understand spiritually. We separate, we bifurcate, we live in such sort of siloed notions of ourselves that isn't actually true. And one thing about being out in nature, particularly if you're walking, is it connects you back to your body. You have to feel the grass underneath your feet. Or if you're getting older like me and your back starts to hurt or your knees start to hurt, you actually have to pay attention to your body. And I think this is no small thing, that we live so disconnected from ourselves, that one of the things that creation has for us, whether it's out in the middle of nowhere or it's on a walk in our neighborhood, is it brings us back to the present that is our body. Finally, the obvious thing, creation gives us the gift of wonder. My wife is a nanny, and the 2-year-old that she watches has been enamored with cicadas, both the dead ones that are still all together, but also the shells. And so Jen will occasionally grab one out of the backyard and take it with her the next day to show the little girl she nannies. And it's pulled me into a sense of wonder, that the miracle of cicadas, even when they're loud and I can't sleep because they're so loud, they are amazing. Whether it's as small as a cicada or as big as the Grand Canyon, one thing that creation does is it gives us a sense of wonder that might lead to gratitude, wonder that might lead to curiosity, wonder that might open us up beyond ourselves. So a few practical things I really want to invite you to do. These are super simple. Go to a park. Go to a park. Don't take your AirPods. Don't take your phone to listen to a podcast or music. Don't talk on the phone. Just go to a park and just sit. Notice the trees. Notice the wind moving the trees. Notice the people walking their dogs, the squirrels as they're dancing and playing and going through the park. Just go to a park and just pay attention, even if it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes. This does pretty remarkable things for the soul. Go on a walk in your neighborhood and notice God's creation, trees, landscaping, bushes, animals that are present, birds that are in air, mosquitoes. I'm not convinced there's any good in mosquitoes, but God created them, so I'm trying to convince myself it's the case. But go on a walk and just pay attention to God's creation. Sit in your backyard or on your back porch and just look out, see what's right outside the window. And finally, I want to say this. I've been inspired by the little girl my wife nannies. Pick up something small and investigate it. Wonder where it began, what its story is. Allow yourself to get lost in the miracle and how remarkable it is that this little small thing is made up of so many little components by God's creative hand that we can't even count. So a month from now, I fly to the Pacific Northwest, and I have a 60-mile backpacking trip scheduled with 3 of my best friends, and I'm really looking forward to it. I need the break. I want the break. I'm eager to be out in the wilderness, but my soul doesn't feel as parched as it has before. I don't feel as angsty as I usually do, because I think instead of trying to squeeze every last drop out of that 5-gallon bucket of water that I bring back from the Northwest, that is a limited resource, I found all of these little watering spots in my own neighborhood, in my own backyard. The wonder of a cicada, blooming of my crepe myrtles in my backyard, the breeze coming off the lake not far from my house, little things that are miracles in and of themselves that bring me back to the goodness and wonder of creation, bring me back to my sense of self, bring me back to a God who created all of it and holds us as well.